The world had shrunk for me to the size of a small, sticky hand in mine. It was my grandson, Leo's hand, and it pulled me forward with the relentless energy of a 7-year-old through the sprawling city zoo. My own world, once a sweeping panorama of architectural blueprints and towering steel skeletons I'd willed into existence, was now this: a slow, careful walk beside a boy whose shoelaces were untied, whose laughter was the only sound that could silence the ghosts of my past. But even here, in this manufactured wilderness of popcorn smells and the distant rumbling roars of caged kings, the most dangerous predator wasn't behind any fence. She was the ghost I was trying to outrun, the woman whose name was etched not only on my heart, but, as I was about to discover, on the very exhibit that would threaten to tear what was left of my world apart. The world had shrunk for me to the size of a small, sticky hand in mine. Leo's hand. He pulled me forward with the relentless energy of a 7-year-old, his bright red sneakers squeaking on the asphalt path. Autumn had laid a cool hand on the city, but here in the zoo, the sun was warm on the back of my neck. "Are we there yet, Grandpa?" Leo asked for the 10th time. "Patience, Captain," I said, my voice a little breathless. My cane, a sleek black thing my daughter insisted I use, made a steady thump-thump-thump beside his squeaking shoes. A 2-part rhythm for a 2-person parade. "The lions aren't going anywhere." He pointed a finger, smeared with what I hoped was chocolate, at a signpost. "It's that way." "I heard them!" He was right. A low, rumbling roar had just drifted over the chatter of the crowd, a sound that vibrated deep in my chest. It was a sound of primal power, of a world that existed long before the steel and glass skeletons I'd spent my life designing. For a moment, every person on the path paused, heads turning toward the sound. A shared, ancient stillness. The air smelled of popcorn and roasted peanuts, a sweet and dusty perfume layered over the musky scent of damp earth and unseen animals. We were standing in front of the antelope enclosure, a wide, grassy expanse where a herd of sable antelope grazed under the painted blue sky of a concrete wall. I tried to explain the elegant curve of their horns, the physics of their design. I saw things in lines and structures. "It's the curse of the architect." Leo was not impressed. "They just look like big goats, Grandpa." He was already tugging me away. Lions are cooler. Everything to him was simple. Cool or not cool, go or stop. I envied him that. My world was a labyrinth of things I should have done, words I should have said. My daughter's voice from the phone call that morning echoed in my head. "Just have fun, Dad. He's been looking forward to this all week." A pause. Is she working today? You know how he gets when he sees her?" My grip had tightened on the receiver. "I don't know, honey. I'll keep him clear of that section. Just try to avoid the big cat exhibits, Dad, please." A simple request, but it felt like a judgment. Elena. Even her name was a stone in my gut. Dr. Elena Vance. For 40 years, she had been a force of nature in my life. For the last 10, she had been a ghost. A ghost who curated the big cat exhibits at the city zoo. "Grandpa? You okay?" Leo was looking up at me, his brow furrowed with a seriousness that was a miniature copy of his grandmother's. I forced a smile. "Never better. Just catching my breath." I rested my hand on the cool, worn metal of a park bench. The familiar ache in my knee was a dull throb, a steady reminder that my body was a building with a failing foundation. Leo's warmth next to me was the only thing holding it all up. He was my redemption, my second chance to be the man who stayed, the man who paid attention. My life's work stood tall across the city skyline, monuments of glass and steel that would outlive me by centuries. But what good was a legacy etched in stone when the one you built it for had walked away? I had given Elena a beautiful house, a life of comfort. She had wanted my time. I never understood the difference until it was gone. "Can I get a hot dog?" Leo asked, his eyes wide and hopeful. "With extra ketchup?" "Of course," I said, grateful for the distraction. "My treat." We found a vendor cart near the reptile house, its faded green paint peeling near the wheels. The hiss of the grill was loud, the smell of sizzling onions thick in the air. As I paid, my gaze drifted to my reflection in the polished chrome of the napkin dispenser. The man looking back was a stranger. His hair was thin and white, his face a roadmap of lines I didn't remember earning. When had this old man replaced me? It felt like only yesterday I was sketching blueprints on a napkin just like this one. Elena laughing across the table, her eyes brighter than any future I could imagine. Leo devoured his hot dog in 6 bites, a smear of ketchup decorating his left cheek like a battle scar. His energy restored, he was off again, pulling me past the slumbering pythons and the bored-looking crocodiles. The crowd grew thicker here, a slow-moving river of strollers and chattering families. The air grew heavier with that wild feline musk, and the roars were closer, deeper. We turned a corner landscaped with heavy decorative boulders and thick bamboo. And there it was, a massive sweeping enclosure designed to look like a North African savanna. A deep, dry moat separated a sandstone-colored viewing platform from a wide expanse of rock and parched grass. Carved into the faux rock wall above the main viewing window was a grand, sweeping title, Kale's Kingdom. My heart seized. Below the title, in smaller, elegant letters, was a plaque, Habitat curated by Dr. Elena Vance in honor of the majestic Barbary lion, my daughter's warning, my promise to her. All of it crumbled to dust. I had walked us right to the one place on Earth I was supposed to avoid. Before I could turn us around, Leo let go of my hand and ran to the thick safety glass, pressing his face against it. "Whoa," he breathed, his voice fogged onto the pain. "He's huge." Out on a high rock, sunning himself, was the king. Kale. He was magnificent, a creature of raw, effortless power, his dark mane a formidable crown. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of something, not fear, but a profound sense of trespassing. This was her world, not mine. I took a step forward, my cane tapping on the stone floor, ready to pull Leo away, to make an excuse about the monkeys or the seals. But my eyes caught a detail on the plaque I had missed. It wasn't just curated by her. Etched into the brass was a smaller line of text, almost an afterthought. A special dedication to Kale, raised by hand from the day he was born. The words on that plaque changed the air. The space between me and the lion, separated by inches of reinforced glass and a concrete moat, suddenly felt charged and deeply personal. Raised by hand. This wasn't just an exhibit Elena curated. It was a testament to a relationship. She hadn't just studied this animal. She had, in a way, mothered him. It felt like I was looking at a page from a diary I was never meant to read. Kyle lifted his massive head, his amber eyes seeming to scan the crowd with regal indifference. A shiver traced its way down my spine. Those were the eyes of a killer, a perfect predator, and Elena had looked into them every day. What did she see? A sun? A scientific marvel? Or just a reflection of the wildness that had always called to her more than I ever could? "Grandpa, look!" Leo's voice sliced through my thoughts. He was no longer at the glass. He had scrambled onto one of the large decorative boulders that formed the barrier's edge, trying to get a better view over the heads of the people in front of us. The rocks were arranged artfully, meant to look natural, but their surfaces were worn smooth by countless hands and shoes. "Leo, get down from there," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "It's not safe, but I can't see," he complained, planting his red sneakers firmly on the stone. "He's moving!" My heart began to beat a little faster. The crowd was 3 people deep at the railing, a wall of backs and shoulders. I started to push my way through, my cane's rubber tips slipping on the polished concrete. "Excuse me," I muttered, the words getting lost in the ambient noise. "Pardon me, my grandson." Kale was indeed moving. He stretched, a lazy, powerful flex of muscle and sinew, and then began to pace the edge of his territory. With every step, his huge paws landed with a silent, menacing grace. He was magnificent, and a new wave of awe and fear washed over the crowd. Phones came out, held high to capture the moment. "Leo, I mean it. Right now." My voice was tight with an anxiety I couldn't explain. It was a premonition, a cold dread coiling in my stomach. He took one more step up, trying to peer over a man's broad shoulders. His foot, clad in that slick-soled sneaker, landed on a patch of the rock, slick with condensation from the morning air. It happened in sickening slow motion. One foot slipped. His balance, so certain a moment ago, was gone. His arms pinwheeled, his mouth opened in a silent O of surprise, and then he was gone. He simply vanished over the edge. For a single, suspended heartbeat, there was only the sound of the crowd, the distant squawk of a macaw, the hum of the world going on as normal. Then came a faint, sickening thud from below, and then silence. A profound, absolute void of sound as every person on the platform froze, their minds catching up to what their eyes had just seen. The silence was worse than a scream. It was a vacuum, and my own scream was trapped inside it. I finally broke through the line of people. I gripped the thick railing, the cold metal biting into my palms, and looked down, 15 feet. The drop was 15 feet into a dry concrete moat, and at the bottom, curled in a heap of red jacket and blue jeans, was Leo. He wasn't moving. My mind fractured. One part, the architect, clinically assessed the distance, the material, the sheer impossibility of survival. The other part, the grandfather, simply shattered. A guttural noise tore from my throat, a sound I'd never heard myself make. "Leo!" My shout broke the spell. The silence was replaced by a tidal wave of noise. Gasps, screams, a woman crying, "Oh my God, the child!" And from his rock, Cale heard it all. He stopped pacing. His head came up, ears swiveling toward the commotion. Then his gaze dropped to the moat, to the small, colorful shape that hadn't been there a moment before. With a fluid, terrifying grace, he leaped down from his perch onto the grassy floor of his enclosure. Panic ignited. People scrambled backward, a panicked stampede away from the railing. Zoo security guards were suddenly there, their voices sharp and urgent. "Everybody back! Move away from the enclosure! Now!" But I couldn't move. I was fused to the spot, my world shrunk to the scene below. Kyle was approaching Leo. He wasn't running, wasn't charging. He was stalking, his movements filled with a predator's cautious curiosity. He lowered his head, sniffing the air, his tail giving a slow, almost lazy twitch. "Somebody do something!" I roared at a guard who was trying to pull me away from the railing. His hands were strong, but my terror gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I clung to the rail, my knuckles bone white. His radio crackled to life, a frantic voice on the other end. "Code Red, Cale's Kingdom. Child in the enclosure!" I repeat, child in the enclosure. An alarm began to blare across the zoo, a shrill, pulsing shriek that cut through the screams. It was the sound of utter catastrophe. I could see other keepers running, their faces pale. One was holding a high-powered rifle. My blood ran cold, the lethal force option. "No," I whispered, the word lost in the din. "No, you can't." Cale was closer now. He nudged Leo's shoulder with his nose. My son's son, my entire world. I felt a surge of impossible, suicidal instinct. I put one hand on the railing, ready to heave myself over, to do the unthinkable. Let it be me, not him. A firm hand clamped down on my shoulder, yanking me back with surprising force. I turned, ready to fight, to scream, to claw my way to my grandson. And I found myself looking into a pair of fiercely familiar eyes. Eyes I knew as well as my own, now wide with a mixture of professional focus and abject horror. She wore a khaki zoo uniform, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight, no-nonsense bun. The face was older, etched with lines of sun and worry, but it was unmistakably her. "Arthur?" Elena's voice was a ragged whisper. Her gaze flickered from my face down into the den, and a strangled gasp escaped her lips. The expert, the scientist, dissolved in an instant, replaced by a woman seeing the ghost of her family in mortal danger. Then, just as quickly, the mask of command snapped back into place. Her eyes hardened. She grabbed the security guard's radio from his belt. "This is Vance," she snapped, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. "Hold lethal force. I repeat, stand down. Get the tranquilizer team ready, but do not fire unless I give the order. Do you copy?" The zoo director, a harried-looking man in a suit, ran up to her. "Elena, we have to neutralize the animal." "It's protocol!" She didn't even look at him. Her eyes were locked on the scene below, her mind clearly working a dozen steps ahead. "Your protocol will get that boy killed." "What are you talking about?" The director sputtered, his face flushed. "A tranquilizer is the only non-lethal option." "It's not an instant solution, Robert," Elena said, her voice dangerously low and steady, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. Every ounce of her 69 years of expertise was in that tone. The dart takes 5 minutes, maybe more, to bring down a 400-pound male. The impact alone, the sting of the needle, could shock him into aggression. He'll close the distance to that boy in less than a second. She didn't need to finish the sentence. We could all see it. Kyle was circling Leo now, his movement slow, deliberate. He let out a low, guttural chuff, a sound that seemed to vibrate up through the concrete and into the soles of my shoes. My body was a live wire of useless adrenaline. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic prisoner demanding escape. "So what's the plan, Elena?" the director demanded, gesturing helplessly at the scene. "We can't just stand here." Elena turned her gaze from the enclosure to me. The look in her eyes was a complicated, terrible thing. There was the sharp assessment of a zoologist, the terror of a woman seeing her grandson in danger, and something else, a decade of cold anger, a deep glacial rage that the years had not thawed. It was the look of a woman who had been abandoned and was now being asked to run. "Back into the burning building. I'm going in," she said. The words fell into the chaos and created their own pocket of stunned silence. The director stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. A security guard took an involuntary step forward. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Absolutely not," the director said, finding his voice. "That's against every regulation we have. It's suicide." "It's the only chance he has," she countered, already shrugging off her light khaki jacket and handing it to a stunned keeper. Underneath, she wore a simple dark green work shirt, its sleeves already rolled up to reveal sinewy forearms. She was all purpose, all motion. I raised him. I know his vocalizations, his postures. I am the only variable in this equation he might recognize as something other than a threat. She moved toward a small steel service gate set into the rock wall, a door I hadn't even noticed. As the keeper fumbled with a ring of keys, Elena paused to look at me again. The ghost of our shared past stood between us, more real and more solid than the panicked people surrounding us. "All those years?" "Arthur," she said, her voice so low I could barely hear it over the frantic radio chatter. "All those years I begged you to be present for your family, for our daughter, for me." Her words were not just an accusation. They were surgical instruments, cutting away the scar tissue of my denial. I saw it all in a flash flood of memory. The dinners I'd missed for deadlines, the school plays I'd skipped for client meetings, the anniversaries I'd forgotten. The 1,000 small abandonments that had amounted to a colossal failure. I had built a city, but I had let my own home fall into ruin. "Elena, My own voice was a dry rasp. What could I say? "I'm sorry?" The words were meaningless ash in my mouth. "He's all I have left." It was a pathetic plea, the desperate cry of a bankrupt man. She held my gaze for a moment longer, her expression unreadable. Then she turned away. "I'm not doing this for you," she said, the words like chips of ice. The gate creaked open with a groan of protesting metal. Before she stepped through, she issued a final, sharp command to the head of security. "Keep him here. Don't let him near the glass. The last thing I need is him distracting Kale." And then she was gone, inside. The gate clanged shut, the sound of a vault door sealing. The world narrowed to the scene in the den. Elena didn't walk toward Leo. She moved laterally along the concrete wall of the moat, keeping her body angled, non-threatening. Her steps were slow, deliberate, her posture communicating a quiet deference. From a small pouch on her belt, she pulled out a piece of meat, a steak maybe, dark and red. She held it in her left hand, her right hand held open and low. Cale saw her. His head, which had been lowered toward Leo, snapped up. His ears flattened for a second, a flicker of aggression. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound like distant thunder. My breath caught in my throat. My hands were balled into fists, my nails digging into my palms, the sharp sting a faint anchor in a swirling sea of terror. "Easy, Kyle," Elena's voice carried across the enclosure, calm and steady. It was a tone I hadn't heard in years, the one she used to use on our daughter after a nightmare. Soft, firm, a blanket of sound. "Easy, my boy. It's just me." She wasn't speaking English. She was making soft, chuffing sounds, the same kind of noise I'd heard the lion make. It was a conversation. She was speaking his language. The lion took a step toward her, away from Leo. He was wary, confused. His massive tail, which had been twitching with agitation, now swept the ground in a slow, uncertain arc. He was a king in his castle, and a stranger had just entered his throne room. But the stranger smelled familiar. The stranger spoke his tongue. I was being held back by a guard, his hand firm on my bicep. I didn't fight him. I was paralyzed, a spectator at the most terrifying event of my life. I could feel the rough texture of his uniform sleeve against my cheek, could smell the faint scent of stale coffee on his breath. My entire universe, all my regrets and all my hopes were condensed into that impossible scene below. An old woman, an old man's grandson, and a lion caught between the wild and the memory of a human touch. Time stretched and warped. Each second Elena was in that enclosure felt like an hour. The 10 years since I'd last spoken to her, a half-forgotten dream. My world was the cool, unyielding pressure of the guard's hand on my arm, the frantic pulse beating in my own neck, and the slow-motion drama unfolding below. Elena kept her focus entirely on Kyle. It was an act of supreme discipline. I knew that every maternal instinct in her body must be screaming at her to run to Leo, to check if he was breathing, to shield him with her own body. But she ignored him. To acknowledge the boy would be to claim him, to turn him into a prize to be fought over in the lion's territorial mind. So she pretended he wasn't there. "Hey, Cale," she crooned, her voice a low melodic hum. She took another slow, shuffling step to her right, putting herself on a direct line between the lion and the spot where Leo lay. "It's all right, big boy. Shh, it's all right." The chuffing sounds continued, a series of soft, breathy coughs from deep in her chest. Cale mirrored the sound, but his was deeper, a question rumbling in a cavernous chest. He took another step toward her, his head low, his huge padded paws making no sound on the packed earth. I could see the muscles ripple under his tawny hide. He was a perfect anatomy of power, and she was a small, frail woman armed with nothing but memory and nerve. My own breath was ragged in my ears. I could smell the sharp, metallic scent of my own fear sweat. My knuckles, still gripping my cane, ached from the pressure. The cane felt absurdly flimsy, a useless prop. For a man who had built skyscrapers, I had never felt so utterly powerless, so stripped of any ability to impose order on the world. From my vantage point, I could see Leo's chest rise and fall, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was there. He was alive. The relief was a physical blow, making my knees buckle. The guard's grip tightened, holding me up. Elena saw it too. I caught the faintest flicker of her eyes toward the boy, a micro-expression of relief that was gone as quickly as it appeared. Her focus snapped back to Kyle. He was only 20 feet from her now. She stopped moving, holding her ground. This was the critical moment. She was an intruder, and she had stopped retreating. Now she was a challenge. The lion's tail began to twitch again, the black tuft at the end flicking back and forth like a metronome, counting down to violence. His ears angled, listening, processing. He was weighing instinct against memory. The instinct was ancient, hardwired into his DNA, protect territory, eliminate threats. The memory was of her scent, her voice, the feeling of her hands. In that agonizingly long pause, a memory of my own surfaced. It was from 30 years ago, in the kitchen of our old house. Elena was working late at the university then, a doctoral student poring over charts of animal behavior. I had come home from the firm, full of my own self-importance after landing a new contract, and found her crying at the table. A grant she'd been counting on had been rejected. "It's all I think about, Arthur," she had said, pushing stacks of papers away, trying to understand how they think, how they communicate. It's like learning a language that no one else speaks. I hadn't understood. I had patted her shoulder, offered to take her to a fancy dinner to celebrate my own success, a clumsy, useless gesture that showed how little I was listening. I had seen her passion as a hobby, not the center of her universe. Now I was watching her speak that language. She raised the hand holding the piece of meat just a few inches. Cale's eyes locked onto it. A low growl started, deeper this time. It was a warning. Elena didn't flinch. She began to speak to him again, but her tone shifted. It was still soft, but there was a new firmness to it, a note of gentle command. It was the voice of a mother correcting a beloved but misbehaving child. She took a tiny, almost imperceptible step forward. The growl hitched in the lion's throat, cut off by surprise. She had defied him. She had encroached, and then she did something that made my heart stop. She tossed the chunk of meat, not at him, but to the far side of the enclosure, a good 50 feet away. It landed with a soft thud in the dry grass. Cale's head whipped around to follow the motion. For a split second, he was frozen, a statue of conflicted impulse. The offering, the boy, the woman. His brain, a magnificent engine of predatory instinct, seemed to stall. The meat was an easy prize. The boy was an unknown curiosity. The woman was a complex and powerful memory. He chose the meat. With a loping, almost casual gait, he turned and moved toward the treat. The tension that had held the entire crowd in a state of suspended animation broke. A collective sigh of relief went through the air. It seemed to be working. Elena's gamble, her intimate knowledge of this one specific animal, was paying off. She wasted no time. The moment Cale's back was turned, she scurried over to Leo. She didn't try to lift him. She just knelt, her hands hovering over him, checking for injuries. I saw her touch his neck, likely feeling for a pulse, then gently run a hand over his head. Leo stirred. He let out a soft, pained groan. The sound was quiet, barely audible from where I stood. But in the preternatural silence of the enclosure, the lion heard it. His head shot up from the grass, the meat forgotten. He whipped around, his body instantly coiling with tension. He saw Elena hunched over the boy. He saw the movement, and his interpretation of the scene changed in a flash. It wasn't a rescue. It was an intrusion, a threat, a claim on the new, interesting thing in his territory. A roar tore out of him, but this was nothing like the rumbles from before. This was a full-throated, deafening blast of sound that hit me like a physical force. It was pure primal rage. It was a declaration of ownership and a promise of violence. He abandoned the meat and started toward them, not stalking now, but striding, his head low and his golden eyes blazing with lethal intent. The tranquilizer team, positioned on the roof of a nearby building, raised their rifle. Elena looked up, her face a mask of dawning horror. Her plan, so perfectly executed, had just failed. The world dissolved into a tunnel of vision. At one end, the approaching lion, a fluid engine of destruction. At the other, my wife, my ex-wife, and my grandson, exposed and vulnerable. Everything else, the panicked crowd, the shouting guards, the wail of a distant city siren, faded into a dull, meaningless roar. I saw the glint of sunlight on the sniper's scope. A small, star-like flash from the rooftop across the way. They were going to shoot. Robert, the zoo director, was next to me, screaming into his radio. "Take the shot! Take the shot now! No!" The word ripped from my throat, raw and useless. Elena was on her feet, placing her body squarely between Kyle and Leo. It was a purely instinctual act, a mother shielding her young. It was brave and magnificent and utterly futile. She was a paper shield against a battering ram. Kale didn't slow. He was 30 feet away, 25. I saw what was about to happen with sickening clarity. The rifle would fire. The dart hopefully would hit its mark. The lion, shocked and wounded, would surge forward in a final, explosive burst of adrenaline and tear her apart before the sedatives ever touched his brain. The protocol was a death sentence. Robert was going to kill her. Time seemed to bend. In that stretched-out moment, I wasn't a frail 72-year-old man with an aching knee. I was the man I had been 40 years ago, the one who had promised to protect her, the one who had failed at every turn. That promise, buried under decades of regret and resentment, roared back to life. It was the only thing left in me that was still strong, my cane. I was still holding it, my grip of vice. It was black, carbon fiber, a gift from my daughter meant to signify my weakness. But it was solid, heavy. I don't remember deciding to do it. My body simply acted, a final, desperate rebellion against a lifetime of passive failure. I shoved past the director, ignoring his shout of surprise. The guard who had been holding me back turned, his eyes wide. I swung the cane with all the strength I possessed. It wasn't aimed at him. The cane connected with the thick, laminated safety glass right in front of me. The impact produced a deafening crack that was more of a boom, a sound like a gunshot inside a small room. It didn't break the glass. The stuff was an inch thick, but a spiderweb of fractures erupted from the point of impact, and the sound it made was explosive. Every head jerked toward the noise. The sniper on the roof, the guards on the platform, and Kale, the lion, 20 feet from Elena enclosing, flinched violently. He stopped dead in his tracks, his charge interrupted. His head whipped toward the source of the sudden sharp sound, his eyes trying to pinpoint the new threat. He let out a confused, frustrated growl. It was only a second. A single heartbeat-long pause. But it was everything. Elena seized the moment. Her face, which had been a mask of grim acceptance, was now alight with a fierce, desperate intelligence. She wasn't looking at me. She wasn't looking at Leo. She was locked onto the lion, her mind racing, recalculating. The sniper was hesitating, his target momentarily confused. This was her last chance. Her only chance. She didn't back away. She didn't scream. She took a single, deliberate step toward the lion. Then she made a sound. It wasn't one of the soft, communicative chuffs from before. It was a sharp, guttural, explosive sound from deep in her diaphragm. A sound that was half bark, half roar. It was jarring, unnatural, and utterly commanding. It was a sound of pure dominance. Kale recoiled as if struck. His ears went flat against his skull. He took a staggering step back, his massive front paws skidding slightly on the packed earth. The sheer surprise of it had completely derailed his predatory advance. He looked at her, and for the first time I saw something other than instinct in his eyes. I saw confusion. He was a king who had just been challenged for his throne, not by a rival male, but by the small, strange creature who had fed him from a bottle, whose scent was tangled up with his first memories of the world. She held his gaze, her body radiating an authority that seemed to swell, making her appear larger than she was. She was no longer prey. She was his equal. Slowly, deliberately, Kale lowered his head. It was a subtle movement, just a few inches, but the meaning was unmistakable. It was a concession, a bow, a flicker of memory winning out over 1,000,000 years of instinct. Elena didn't break eye contact. She began to back away, one slow step at a time, her movements fluid and sure. When she reached Leo, she bent down, never looking away from the lion, and scooped him into her arms. It was a struggle. He was a dead weight, and she was not a young woman. I saw the strain in her face, the cords of muscle standing out on her neck. But she did it. She got him up, cradling his unconscious form against her chest, and she kept backing away. Toward the keeper's gate, 10 feet to safety. Cale watched her go, his head still low. He didn't move. He just watched, a statue of gold and muscle, his wildness momentarily tamed by a ghost from his past. The keeper at the gate, a young man with a terrified expression, swung it open. Elena shuffled backward through the opening. The second she was clear, he slammed it shut. The clang of the heavy steel bolt sliding home was the loudest, most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The moment the gate bolted shut, the spell was broken. Elena's legs gave out, and she slumped against the rock wall, still clutching Leo, her entire body shaking with reaction. The sound of the crowd surged back in, a chaotic wave of gasps, applause, and relieved sobs. Paramedics, who had been waiting in a terrifyingly neat line, rushed forward with a gurney. They tried to take Leo from her, but her arms were locked around him. "Is he breathing?" She gasped, her face pale and beaded with sweat. "Check him, now!" One of the medics pressed 2 fingers to Leo's neck, then looked up at her. "Strong pulse. He's breathing fine. Ma'am, we need to take him." Her grip loosened and she relinquished him. As they gently placed my grandson on the stretcher, strapping him in, my paralysis finally broke. I pushed past the stunned director and the guards, my cane forgotten, and stumbled toward her. The spiderwebbed glass was a monument to my terror, a frozen moment of impact. I didn't go to Leo. The paramedics were with him. They were professionals. My world, in that moment, had narrowed to Elena. She was still leaning against the wall, her eyes closed, her chest heaving. The sheer, overwhelming force of what she had just done seemed to be crashing down on her. She had faced down death, had bent the will of a predator to her own, and the cost of that effort was etched on her face. I stopped a few feet away from her, my own body trembling. The air was thick with the scent of her fear, a sharp, coppery smell that mingled with the dusty scent of the enclosure. I could see a smear of dirt on her cheek and a small scratch on her forearm where she must have scraped it against the rock. "Elena," I said. My voice was a wreck, a shredded ruin. Her eyes fluttered open. They were exhausted, ancient. They looked at me, and I saw no anger left in them, no resentment, just a bone-deep weariness that seemed to span the 30 years we had been together, and the 10 we had been apart. "What do you say to the woman who has just saved your world?" Thank you felt like an insult, a pebble of a word for a mountain of a deed, so I said nothing. I took the final 2 steps, reached out, and pulled her into my arms. She was stiff for a moment, a lifetime of defensive walls still in place. Then, something inside her seemed to crumble, and she collapsed against me, her head finding the hollow of my shoulder. A dry, shuddering sob escaped her, then another. There were no tears, just the raw, ragged sound of a soul that had been stretched to its breaking point. I held her, my hand stroking her hair. It felt the same, thick and soft, though now threaded with silver. I buried my face in her shoulder, and the familiar scent of her skin, a scent I hadn't realized I'd missed so profoundly, filled my senses. It was the scent of home. "I'm sorry," I whispered into her hair, the words tearing their way out of a place I'd kept locked away for a decade. For everything. "I'm so sorry." It wasn't just an apology for the day's terror, for my carelessness that had put Leo in danger. It was an apology for the missed dinners, the forgotten anniversaries, the blind ambition, the monumental selfishness. It was an apology for having been given a language of the heart to learn and choosing, instead, to study blueprints. She didn't answer. She just held on to me, her knuckles pressing into the fabric of my jacket as the paramedics wheeled Leo past us. His eyes were open. He was groggy, his gaze unfocused, but he was awake. He saw us, and a small, confused frown touched his lips. "Grandma?" he murmured, the word thick. Elena pulled away from me, her hands coming up to wipe at her dry cheeks. She looked at Leo on the gurney, and her face softened. the fierce zoologist melting away to reveal the grandmother. "I'm here, sweetheart," she said, her voice still shaky. "You're okay. You're going to be okay." We followed the gurney as it moved through the parting sea of onlookers. The zoo director, Robert, caught my arm. "Arthur," he said, his face ashen. "Your cane, you may have saved her life with that." He looked from me to the fractured glass and back again. "What you both did, it was—" He trailed off, unable to find the words. I barely heard him. My focus was on Elena walking beside the stretcher, her hand resting on Leo's arm. We were a strange, broken little procession, moving through the chaos she had just calmed. As we reached the service vehicle that would take Leo to the hospital, our daughter, Leo's mother Sarah, came running toward us, her face a mask of frantic terror. "She must have been called by the zoo. Mom? Dad?" she cried, her eyes darting from the gurney to us. "What happened?" "They just said there was an accident." She hugged Leo first, a desperate, sobbing embrace. Then she looked at us, standing side by side, and her expression shifted from fear to sheer, unadulterated shock. She hadn't seen us in the same room, let alone willingly touching, in 10 years. The crisis had broken more than just the glass of the enclosure. It had shattered the frozen silence between all of us. At the hospital, the hours blurred together. Leo had a concussion and a fractured wrist from the fall, but he was going to be fine, miraculously fine. Sarah stayed in his room, reading to him in a low, soothing voice. Elena and I sat in the waiting area, on sterile plastic chairs that felt miles apart. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't angry or heavy. It was a quiet, shared space of emotional exhaustion. The television in the corner droned on about politics and weather, a broadcast from a world that no longer seemed real. I bought 2 cups of coffee from a vending machine. They tasted like burnt plastic, but the warmth was something to hold on to. I handed one to Elena, our fingers brushed. A small electric touch that felt both strange and deeply familiar. She took the cup, her hands still not entirely steady. "That sound you made," she said, her voice quiet. "Banging the glass." "I thought they were going to shoot him," I replied, my own voice hoarse. "And you?" She stared down into her cup. "It was the only thing that could have broken his focus. You gave me 1 second, Arthur." She looked up at me and her eyes were clear. It was the second I needed. I didn't know what to say. After a lifetime of taking things from her, her time, her love, her patience, I had finally, in one desperate, violent act, given her something back. She reached over and placed her hand over mine where it rested on my knee. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. For the first time in a decade, we weren't a failed architect and a brilliant zoologist. We were just Arthur and Elena. And her hand, resting on mine, was the weight of a promise I never thought I'd get a chance to keep. The hospital released Leo the next afternoon. He was subdued, his usual boundless energy contained by a bright blue cast on his left arm and the lingering strangeness of the event. He didn't remember the fall, only waking up with a headache and a blurry memory of his grandmother's face. To him, the lion was a half-forgotten dream. To me, the echo of Cale's roar was a permanent resident in my mind. Sarah drove us home, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, checking on Leo in his car seat, then looking at me and Elena in the front. We were a bizarre, impossible sight, an extinct species brought back to life. "I still don't understand how you did it, Mom," Sarah said, breaking a long silence as we navigated the afternoon traffic. "They're calling you a hero on the news." Elena, sitting in the passenger seat of her daughter's car for the first time in years, just shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I was a zookeeper doing her job." She stared out the window at the familiar landscape of the city, at the buildings I had designed. I wondered if she still saw my signature in their steel spines. "I just got lucky." "That wasn't luck," I said quietly. "That was knowledge. That was you." She turned to look at me, and for a moment, the weary quiet between us was charged with something else, something unspoken. The car smelled of the antiseptic cleanliness of the hospital and the faint, sweet scent of the juice box Leo was sipping. It was the smell of normalcy trying to reassert itself. When we got back to Sarah's small suburban house, the place felt like a sanctuary. The front yard was decorated with crookedly carved pumpkins for the coming Halloween, a cheerful, mundane sight that felt deeply reassuring. Inside, Leo immediately curled up on the sofa with his favorite blanket, the one with the faded cartoon dinosaurs, and drifted off to sleep. The physical and emotional ordeal had drained him completely. Sarah made tea. The three of us stood in her kitchen, a room I had only been in a handful of times, an awkward triangle of shared history and fractured connections. The kettle whistled, a shrill domestic sound that was a universe away from the alarms at the zoo. "Dad," Sarah began, her voice hesitant as she poured the steaming water into 3 mugs. "The zoo called. They said you broke the enclosure glass. They're talking about pressing charges for property damage and reckless endangerment." I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. I hadn't even considered the consequences. In that moment, there had been no thought, only a primal need to act. "What?" "Don't worry," Elena said immediately, her voice firm. "I already spoke to Robert. I told him if he even thinks about filing a report, I will hold a press conference and describe in detail how his insistence on a lethal force protocol that would have failed was the only thing recklessly endangering anyone." She took a sip of her tea, her gaze unwavering. He dropped it. I stared at her. She had defended me. After everything, she had stood between me and the consequences of my own actions, just as she had stood between Cale and Leo. "You didn't have to do that," I said, the words feeling inadequate. "Yes," she said, her eyes meeting mine over the rim of her mug. "I did." We stood there in the quiet of the kitchen, the only sounds the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle ticking of a clock on the wall. Sarah watched us, her expression a mixture of confusion and a fragile, nascent hope. She was seeing the parents she remembered from her early childhood, the team that could solve any problem. A team that hadn't existed for a very long time. Later, as the afternoon light began to fade, Elena announced she should be going. The awkwardness returned. "Where do we go from here? What is the protocol for the day after your ex-wife saves your grandson from a lion?" "There were no rule books for this. I'll walk you out," I offered. We stepped out onto the front porch. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy smell of fallen leaves. A few houses down, a dog barked. It was the sound of an ordinary life, a life I had almost shattered. "Kyle," I said, the name feeling strange on my tongue. "Will he be all right?" Elena leaned against the porch railing, her silhouette framed by the setting sun. "He'll be fine," confused for a while. "They'll keep him under observation, but he's a resilient animal." There was a deep affection in her voice when she spoke of him, the love for a difficult, dangerous son. "You know the sound you made? That sharp crack on the glass. It reminded me of something." "What?" "When he was a cub, he was terrified of thunderstorms," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "The first time he heard thunder, he hid under my desk for an hour. The sound of your cane hitting the glass was like a sudden clap of thunder. It didn't just distract him, it scared him. It made him a cub again for a second. I thought about that. My act of desperate, aging violence had somehow tapped into a shared memory between the woman I loved and the beast she had raised. A strange, impossible connection across species, across time. "Elena," I started, my voice tight with the weight of everything I needed to say. "What we had, what I broke, I know an apology isn't enough." She was quiet for a long moment, watching as the streetlights flickered on one by one. "No," she finally said, her voice soft but clear. "It's not, but it's a start." She turned to leave, to walk to her car parked at the curb. This felt like a critical moment, a door swinging shut that might never open again. My hand twitched, wanting to reach for her, but I held back. A decade of distance wasn't erased in a day. It was her choice to make. She took 2 steps down the porch stairs, then paused, her hand on the wooden railing. She didn't turn around. "Sarah is having dinner here on Sunday," she said, her back still to me. "For Leo, to celebrate him being okay." She paused again, and the silence stretched, full of unspoken questions. Was she telling me, or was she inviting me? The choice hung in the cool autumn air, a single critical decision waiting to be made. Sunday arrived cloaked in a soft gray drizzle. The sky wept onto the city, washing the autumn leaves into slick, colorful mosaics on the pavement. Driving to Sarah's house, I kept the wipers on a slow, rhythmic sweep, a hypnotic beat that matched the quiet thrum of anxiety and hope in my chest. I didn't know what to expect. An invitation was not a reconciliation. It was just an open door, and I had a long history of standing on the wrong side of those. When I arrived, Elena's sensible blue sedan was already parked in the driveway. My heart gave a small, nervous lurch. I took a deep breath that smelled of rain and wet earth, straightened my collar, and walked up the path, my cane making a soft, tapping sound on the damp flagstones. Sarah opened the door before I could knock, a warm, genuine smile on her face. "Hi, Dad. Come on in." The house was filled with the rich, savory aroma of roasting chicken. It was a scent of profound and simple comfort. Leo, his blue cast now covered in signatures from his classmates, ran up and wrapped his good arm around my leg. "Grandpa, Grandma's here too," he announced, as if revealing a state secret. "I see that, Captain," I said, ruffling his hair. And there she was. Elena was in the kitchen, standing beside Sarah at the counter, showing her how to properly baste the chicken. She wore a simple gray sweater, her hair down for once, falling in soft silver waves around her shoulders. She looked up as I entered, and our eyes met across the room. There was no tension, no guarded wall, just a quiet, steady acknowledgement. "Arthur," she said, her voice calm. "You made it." "Wouldn't miss it," I replied. The evening unfolded with a gentle, hesitant rhythm. We ate dinner at the small kitchen table, the 3 of us, 4 counting Leo, a configuration that hadn't existed in over a decade. We talked about Leo's school, about a funny movie Sarah had seen, about the city's plan to build a new bridge downtown. We talked about everything and nothing, carefully navigating the safe, shallow waters of conversation. The great, deep ocean of our past was left undisturbed beneath the surface. But the silence was different. For years, silence between me and Elena had been a weapon, a cold, heavy thing full of unspoken accusations. Tonight it was just quiet. It was the comfortable quiet of people who didn't need to fill every moment with noise. After dinner, while Sarah gave Leo his bath, Elena and I found ourselves clearing the table. We moved around each other in the small kitchen with an old, forgotten choreography, a muscle memory of a life lived together. I washed, she dried. My hands, submerged in the warm, soapy water, felt clumsy next to her efficient grace. "I heard from the zoo," she said, her voice low as she polished a plate until it shone. "They're installing a secondary glass barrier at the lion exhibit. Higher and set further back." "That's good," I said. It felt right that something permanent and protective would come from that day of terror. A structural solution, the kind I understood. "I'm also retiring," she added, her voice even. "At the end of the year." I stopped scrubbing, my hands still in the water. I turned to look at her. "Retiring? Elena, that zoo. Those animals, that's your life." "It was," she corrected gently, "for a long time. But standing in that enclosure, seeing Leo on the ground, it changed something. My focus shifted." She set the plate down and looked at me, her eyes clear and direct. "I spent 40 years trying to understand the language of animals because I thought it was more honest than the language of people. I think maybe I was wrong, or maybe I was just hiding." The admission hung in the warm, steam-filled air between us. It was a confession as profound as my own apology had been. We had both been hiding in our own ways. Me in my blueprints and boardrooms, her in her enclosures and academic papers. We finished the dishes in that new, comfortable silence. Later, we all sat in the living room. Leo, clean and warm in his pajamas, leaned against Elena on the sofa, showing her a book about planets. He pointed to a picture of Saturn. "That's my favorite," he declared. I watched them from an armchair across the room. The lamplight caught the silver in her hair, the bright, trusting wonder on my grandson's face. This was it. This was the legacy that mattered. Not the buildings, not the accolades. This small, fragile, beautiful moment. As the evening wound down, I knew it was time for me to leave. I stood up, the old ache in my knee a familiar companion. "Well," I said, the word feeling heavy and final. "I'll walk you out," Elena said, gently moving a sleeping Leo's head from her lap onto a cushion. We stood on the porch again, just as we had a few days before. The rain had stopped. The clouds had parted, revealing a spray of stars in the dark, clean-washed sky. The air was cold now, and I could see my breath. "Arthur," she said, her arms crossed against the chill. "What happens now?" I looked at her, at the woman I had loved, lost, and found again in the most impossible of circumstances. I thought of the long, empty years and the terrifying, clarifying seconds in front of the lion's den. I thought of second chances and how rarely they are given. I didn't have a grand blueprint. I didn't have a 5-point plan. All I had was a single, simple truth. "I don't know," I said honestly. I reached out, not with the desperation of a drowning man, but with the quiet confidence of someone who has finally found solid ground. I took her hand. It was cool in the night air, but it felt right in mine. But for the first time in a very long time, I'd like to find out together. A slow smile spread across her face, a real smile that reached her eyes and erased the last shadows of the past. "I think," she said, squeezing my hand, "that's a good start." We stood there for a long time, hand in hand on the quiet porch, under the distant stars, listening to the peaceful, ordinary silence of a family mending.